You are listening to the Our View podcast, where we aim to educate, raise awareness, and change the tone of conversation about disabilities. Every week, we bring you episodes that are centered around topics related to disabilities. As the host, it is my hope that you are not just inspired by these stories that are shared, but that you put some action behind your inspiration to do something that improves the lives of those who live with disabilities. I thank you, our loyal listeners, for your support and remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Our View for Life and to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts to tell us what you enjoy most about the podcast. Let's get into this conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Stephanie. Can you introduce yourself and share with us how having a diagnosis of cerebral or cortical visual impairment has impacted your son?
Hi, thank you for having me today. My name is Stephanie Duesing, and I am an author, speaker, and international advocate for people who have cerebral or sometimes cortical visual impairment or CVI. We discovered back in 2017 that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son Sebastian was almost completely blind, and nobody knew, not even Sebastian himself. And we were absolutely devastated and completely baffled, as my honor student had passed every vision test every year. And so we had no idea that he had any disability of any kind whatsoever. And long story short, he turns out he has a totally unique, never before known to science form of visual processing. My son Sebastian is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he quite literally sees with words, just like a bat sees with sound. And to help your listeners to understand, I want to take a moment to talk about someone else. His name is Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish lost both eyes to cancer in infancy and taught himself how to echolocate. And so Daniel has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. He can read if the letters are three-dimensional. And when they put Daniel into an fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging system, Daniel's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. So Daniel quite literally sees with sound, just like a bat or a whale. Like Daniel, my son has unique visual processing. My son is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally. He has to think the verbal characteristics of how we describe how something looks in order to get a visual image of it. According to Dr. Lotfi Marabet, who is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Shepard's Eye Research Institute, which is part of Harvard, my son is the most studied individual in the world with CVI. So my son has spent quite a lot of time in the fMRI as well, and my son's visual cortex lights up when he thinks word descriptors to himself. And so my son is actually the only person in the world to be able to choose to see or not see with his eyes wide open, which means that actually my son spends most of his conscious waking hours with his vision off. And so he is almost entirely blind, and we didn't even know. And so I'm here today to talk about cerebral, or what's sometimes called cortical visual impairment, or CVI.
Yeah.
We have research coming out of the UK now showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI. And so that makes CVI more prevalent than autism. We CVI moms call CVI the common disability that no one has ever heard of, because every time I talk about it, people are like, I've never heard of this. And it's completely common, and it is regularly misdiagnosed as autism, intellectual disabilities, emotional and behavioral disorders. And it's devastating. It's what happened to us, not knowing that our son was blind till he was 15. This is actually common. This happens all the time to people because there's no diagnostic code for CVI currently. I was in Bethesda, Maryland at the National Institute of Health in November this past year. They had the first trans NIH CVI workshop, and they are starting to work on a consensus agreement, a definition of what CVI is, so that they can work towards creating a diagnostic code for it.
Can you tell us more about what cerebral or cortical visual impairment, also known as CVI, is?
I'll start with what is ocular blindness? Ocular blindness is what most people think about when they think about being blind. And that is caused by damage to the eye or to the optic nerve. I'm going to talk today about cerebral visual impairment, which is a brain-based form of visual impairment or blindness. CVI is caused by damage to the brain, to the visual processing centers of the brain. And so they've actually measured the amount of time that it takes between when the light strikes the back of the eye, which is called the retina, and then it's translated into a electrical signal, and then it goes through the optic nerve to the back of the brain. It takes approximately a tenth of a second after the light strikes the retina of the eye and goes to the back of the brain before there's any conscious perception of sight at all. So, in other words, we do not see with our eyes. All of our conscious perception of sight happens within our brains. So we see with our brains. Our eyes are just light collectors that collect the light and create it into a signal. And then
Hmm.
the actual seeing happens in our brains. And so when people have damage to their brains or any type of malformation of the brain, that can impact our visual processing and all of our vision. There are two different pathways in the brain that are connected together. And if you think about the dorsal fin of a shark, right? We have the
Hmm.
dorsal stream and then we have the ventral stream of visual processing. So it starts in the back of the brain, and then the dorsal stream is the unconscious visual processing. And that's where like we map our environments. That's kind of like the where are things. And so one example I use a lot of the times that people who have damage to the dorsal stream of their brain often have difficulty doing activities like the children's book Where's Waldo? I don't know if you
Hmm.
remember that, the little guy with the
Yeah.
red and white striped shirt and the very cluttered environment.
Hmm.
If you have dorsal stream impairment, you can find just looking at Where's Waldo to be so overwhelming it makes you feel nauseous, right? So that's just an example of dorsal stream processing, like finding things in a crowd, finding people in a crowd, going to the grocery store and finding the right cereal on the shelf that is filled with all kinds of cereals. Those are all things that people with dorsal stream impairment can struggle with, as well as navigating. It can be very difficult to navigate when the brain isn't mapping the environment. Then there's the ventral stream of the brain, which runs through more of the middle part of the brain, and that's where recognition takes place. So if you take your right hand and you touch above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is. And the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is where facial recognition takes place. People who have damage to that area of the brain often have a condition called face blindness or prosopagnosia. And so that's one of the things that my son has. Um, and that's an inability to recognize faces. People who have prosopagnosia or face blindness very often have another condition called topographical agnosia, which is the inability to recognize their environments. So when you have topographical agnosia, it doesn't matter how many times you walk into your own home or your own bedroom, nothing ever looks familiar because there's no visual memory being recorded of the surroundings around you. So that's another thing that my son has.
When was it, or how did you notice that something was happening with your son's vision?
So I know people were like listening at the beginning going, how could you not know your child was blind till they were 15? Well, the only things that my son can recognize, like a typically sighted person can, are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. Because the parts of his brain that are involved in recognizing those things were not damaged when I almost died giving birth to him. And so my son can see and recognize words, letters, numbers, simple shapes, just like a typically sighted person can, even though he can't see faces or places or objects or biological forms. He can't see any of that, but the words and the letters and the numbers jump out at him. So his visual experience, my best way of explaining it is like imagine if you were out in a boat in the middle of a very foggy ocean and the fog was not gray, it was colorful and it was moving swirls of just colors and blobs of shapes and blurry things that you've no idea what they are. And they just kind of float past you. And it's just this blurry blob of moving colors and shapes all around you. And every once in a while, a sign floats past and it might say Walmart, or it might say, you know, the gas station, or, any type of sign. It might be a book. It could say The Catcher in the Rye, or, could be, but all you see are the words. You don't see the sign. You can't see the sign. You can't see the store. You can't see the tree next to the store. You just see the words on the sign. And so that's what my son's vision is like. And so he was actually he taught himself to read and write at the age of 2.5. My son was, yes, identified as very gifted in kindergarten before the actual gifted program started. It didn't officially start until second grade, because my son was reading and writing. At the age of 2.5, he was reading the old Nancy Drew mystery stories with all the lawyerly language in them. Those are chapter books. He was reading those and understanding them when he was 4. And he actually skipped a grade because his school came to us and told us that they could not meet his needs academically in the grade he was in. And so we actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons. We had no desire to separate him from his wonderful group of friends that he had. But it turned out to be the least bad of the 3 options that the school district gave us. And if you know anything about grade promotion here in the US, you know that it's fairly rare. And when they do it, they look at every single aspect of the child, socially, emotionally, academically, physically, everything. And my son sailed through the grade promotion process without triggering a single alarm in anybody. Not one single person suspected that he was blind or that he had any disability. And well, how did you figure it out? Because if he passed a revision test and he's academically successful, how could he be blind? And so what happened was happened to be going through old photos. And I am one of those moms that managed to make my son a baby book. And then I just gave up on the whole like scrapbooking thing because I am so not crafty. And in the closet behind me, I have $1,500 worth of scrapbooking materials he has a $1,500 baby book is what he has. Because I never went on with any of it. So we were looking at pictures. He was 15 years old and we were looking at pictures we had not looked at for years and years and years because I just am not into that. And I was narrating to him about who is in the pictures because we have family all over the place, Canada, Missouri, Texas,
Mm.
and so there's a lot of people that we don't see often. And so I was saying things like, oh, look, there you are with your cousins from Canada that you haven't seen since you were like 2, and
Mhm.
things like that. And so my only child was looking at pictures of his own face for like half an hour, right? And then
Mhm.
finally, a really cute picture of him, like about the age of 3, popped up on my screen. And I said, oh, look, who's that? And there were just crickets. And finally, he said, well, how should I know? And back in
Mm.
2017, I had never heard of CVI. I had never heard of face blindness. I didn't know it was possible for a human being to be face blind in 2017. I'd never heard of any of it. And so all the hair on my arms just stood up because I was like, what do you mean? That's you. And what he
Mhm.
said was, if you say so. And
Oh.
this was so bizarre to me at that time because my son's actually a very accomplished artist and he draws and paints with photographic realism when he wants to, despite being almost completely blind. And so here is my kid who we have photos making eye contact with us repeatedly and deliberately from his earliest days, not recognizing his own face, and who can draw and paint faces with photographic realism when he wants to, and not recognizing his own face. So this made no sense to me. And so I immediately started quizzing him on other people in the pictures, myself, my husband, 15 years younger, thinner, less gray hair, right? But still,
Mhm.
obviously, us. And he was guessing. He was getting the answers right, but he was very obviously guessing, you know? Excuse me. So that night, I just set to work researching, trying to figure out, well, what's wrong with my kid? And there was so little information that I could find about CVI back in 2017. And remember, I didn't even know the word cerebral visual impairment back then. I didn't know the word prosopagnosia back then. So I was just searching on my phone for facial recognition problems. And all that kept coming up was stuff about facial recognition software, which had nothing to do with what I was looking
Mhm.
for. until I finally found the right combination of search words, and then prosopagnosia came up on my phone. And I was like, aha, this is a real thing. And the information that I found was wrong. Of course, I didn't know that in 2017, but I was like, okay, this is coming from the National Institute of Health, and it's telling me that, yes, this is a real thing, but it's very, very rare.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out the New York Times had an article, I think it was like a year ago in the fall. And 1 in 30 people approximately have prosopagnosia. It's a completely common symptom of a common visual impairment. It's not rare at
Wow.
all. So,
Wow.
yeah, but I didn't know that in 2017. I just
Right.
thought, okay, he's got something, he's got a quirk, and it's not dangerous. And, so I'm like, this is not a big deal, but it's interesting to know. And I'm glad we figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
But then the very next day, we figured out that my son had taught himself to navigate our own home by counting his steps and turns as a toddler. And that's when I got scared, because my son's very academically capable, very artistically capable, and he intended to go off to college in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
counting his steps and turns to navigate. And this is not safe. Because that's when I realized his actual safety was he was in danger. And I also knew that there was no way that I could get him the orientation and mobility training that he needed to learn how to navigate using technology, right? Using like Google Maps on his phone. He could do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I couldn't be there to practice every route he was going to need in college to walk with him. I mean, what college kid wants their mom walking beside them to every class, right? So, so in order to get orientation and mobility training, you have to have a doctor's diagnosis. And I will be happy to share this with you so you can put some links to this after we're done recording. But
Mm-hmm.
the Perkins School for the Blind, which is where my son was eventually diagnosed, has a wonderful, wonderful series of information showing the number. We have about 20% of people who have CVI who are currently diagnosed. We believe at least 80% of the people who actually have it are not diagnosed right now. And they also
Wow.
have Perkins has this wonderful graphic. It's a map of the United States that shows the barriers to getting a diagnosis, and it shows exactly where doctors are that might be able to diagnose CVI, and there's not a single one in Illinois.
Yeah.
So I will put a link to that for you so you can see that. And remember, everything
Yeah.
you see is much better now in 2024 than it was back in 2017.
Right.
So,
Thankfully, it's
right,
things are
we've made
improving as they do, so that's a
yeah,
plus. But it's can be very challenging, I'm sure. To like you said, there wasn't one in your state, so it's
right now there's no one in our state
yeah,
who is qualified to diagnose CVI accurately.
and having
So
the means to travel to get a proper diagnosis is it's not everybody has that
no.
opportunity. So.
Well, and what happened to us is I had actual hard evidence of the fact that my son had a neurological visual impairment in the
Hmm.
form of two separate neuropsych evaluations that were done 7 years apart, both of which showed that my son was scoring in the 99th percentile in his verbal intelligence. And then he was showing this very big gap with the very comparatively low above average score in visual spatial. And this is a kid who excels at math and science. So every time, when I asked the neuropsychologist who provided these exams, well, how is it that my kid is soaring through AP calculus, right, without any problems, and has no problems with math and science, and yet he has this very comparatively low score in visual spatial on the neuropsych evaluation, and they had no answer for me. And I'm like, could it be that he has a neurological visual impairment because he's obviously really, really low in visual spatial? And nope, nope. We were
Wow.
labeled crazy by the medical establishment, and we had $150,000 in medical bills trying to get a diagnosis for my son's common visual impairment. And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from the very first appointment after we discovered what he had. So, because I was
Wow.
on it, I was researching. I'm like, he's got prosopagnosia, he's got topographical agnosia, he's got object agnosia. We figured it out at home. and the doctors had no training in it whatsoever. And so we traveled across the country. We saw optometrists, neuro-optometrists, ophthalmologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, and we just tried to find anyone who could just diagnose my son and prescribe a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility with a white cane. And we were treated like dangerous criminals. I was physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist I'd never even met, who walked into our exam like that, did not even introduce himself, and put his fist in my face and screamed at me in front of my 15-year-old. We had to take my son to Paris for a week-long research study with Dr. Sylvie Chokran, who is the director of the Unit of Vision and Cognition at La Fondation Rothschild, and she's absolutely wonderful. She did a research study just on my son for a week, and they scanned his brain. And the reason this is important is because we were repeatedly and falsely told that there was no possible way that my son could have a neurological visual impairment for a number of reasons. We were falsely told he could not have CVI because he could speak. We were told he could not have CVI because he was academically successful. We were told he could not have CVI because he had a normal appearing MRI scan. And if you know anything about MRI scans, you know that all they show is what the brain looks like. They don't show what the brain is actually doing. And I just want to give a little shout out to Dr. Barry Cran at the Perkins School for the Blind. Absolutely wonderful person and highly involved in CVI research and CVI advocacy. And so he was the one who diagnosed my son. And then Dr. Lotfi Marabet at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. Dr. Marabet teaches ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School and is associate scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear. And so he runs the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. And he and Barry Cran collaborated on a paper that they wrote about Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision, which they proved in the fMRI.
Wow, that is hearing your story is uh, bringing to memory my own story and other stories that have been told on the podcast of parents who just keep fighting for their children, and you know that something isn't right. You know that something's going on, and it's just figuring out what is going on is the goal, and to you do what you can and everything you can to make sure that you find that out. And with your story, it wasn't that long ago that this all was taking place, and the difficulty you said you had in trying to find facial recognition, and what was showing up instead of a medical diagnosis. It was the technology facial recognition things that were showing up. Again, the determination that you show as a parent, that parents have to to advocate for their children when they know that something is going on. That's so always impressive to me, and it's really great that you were able to turn this journey into a book. I really believe that we can really help change the tone of conversation about disabilities through sharing our stories. And the fact that you wrote a book called The Eyeless Mind is that's great. Can you share with us a little bit of what your book is about, and also how it can be purchased? This concludes part one of my conversation with Stephanie. Join us again next week to learn more about what inspired her to write a book. In the meantime, learn more about CVI at the links provided in the show notes, and catch up on all previous episodes of the podcast wherever you listen to your podcast and on our YouTube channel. If you have a topic you think we should discuss on an upcoming episode of the podcast, email us at ourviewforlife@gmail.com.